My name is Steve from Orchid, and today we are excited to bring you Extended Landed Costing from Genatec. Genatec is a well-established Sage solution provider from Canada, and we have worked closely with them for many years. You're all on mute, so please type your questions into the questions area and we will address them soon after the demonstration. If you end up selling inventory before it has been costed, it may result in inaccurate cost of goods sold and incorrect inventory valuations. As a result, we have often come across the requirement to accurately cost inventory before all the related invoices have been received and processed. This requirement often includes container management, as you may be importing your inventory, and Genatec have this covered too. Genatec have built Extended Landed Costing using Orchid's Extender module, so it sits inside Sage 300 like any other Sage module. This means no duplication of data and no new interface to learn. It also lets you leverage standard Sage 300 utilities like the data dictionary to facilitate reporting, and dump and load for data management. Extended Landed Costing is listed on the Orchid Extender marketplace, so you can get additional information there, and Marco will be running through where you can get additional information directly from Genatec as well. I will now hand you over to Marco, and we will be back at the end of the presentation to run through any questions you may have.
Welcome to our demonstration of Extended Landed Costing. To quickly introduce ourselves, we at Genatec are a business partner who have been implementing Sage 300 and its third-party applications for over 25 years. We have now embarked on the use of Orchid Extender to expand on the existing Sage 300 functionality for new automations and new modules to enhance the user experience for Sage 300 customers. So why Extended Landed Costing? Many companies cannot accurately track their cost of goods sold because of additional expenses that may be incurred after product is received and potentially sold. This can lead to inaccurate financial statements, inventory valuations, and missed opportunities for increased profits. Without accurate information about cost of goods sold, it is challenging to make sound business decisions. Companies may be selling products at a loss or even overcharging customers due to inconsistent costing. Let's move on to our solutions. Extended Landed Costing looks to solve this issue by providing tools to manage additional costs prior to the receiving process. Our first option is to capture additional costs during the purchase order process and have those costs automatically injected into PO receipts. For companies looking to manage the full import process, the container management option allows to track various import details as well as container building and bill of ladings while automating the distribution of related costs during receiving. Let's take a look at Level 1 Landed Cost Purchase Orders. We have inserted additional costs within the Sage 300 purchase order screen via a new tab. The PO additional costs will be automatically inserted in the PO receipt related to the purchase order with the default proration that is set up in our option screen. This allows for more accurate costing of the inventory by removing the timing issue related to additional cost invoices that are captured after the initial receipt. The automatic insertion of PO additional costs will apply with integrated third-party modules that generate PO receipts, such as barcode scanning applications and WMS modules. Our second offering is the landed cost for container management. In this option, we have created new screens within Sage 300. The first screen is a container screen. This allows us to capture container-related fields, manage container content including remaining space and weight, insert additional costs related to containers, inquire about the related purchase order lines, inquire about related bill of ladings. Our second screen is the bill of lading screen. This includes a collection of fields related to bill of ladings, allows for insertion of additional costs related directly to the bill of lading, allows us to inquire related PO lines, and inquire about related containers. Next is a new freight job screen. This includes a collection of fields for trip management. It also links purchase order lines with related containers and bill of ladings. We also have added a build cargo option, which allows us to mass select purchase order lines. In inventory control, we have added a new IC item CBM field that allows us to define the item packaged volume for container building and cost allocation. Upon PO receipt, the costs from purchase orders, containers, and bill of ladings are automatically distributed by item volume. We're now going to move on to looking at a quick demo to demonstrate these new options. As you can see, the Extended Landed Costing module, which is built entirely with the Orchid Extender module, presents as a module embedded directly within the Sage 300 desktop. So we'll begin with the level 1 for purchase orders. Before we begin, we'll quickly go through the extended options. And here's where there are a couple of settings that we need to have a quick look at. So we have the proration method for purchase orders. Here we have the standard by quantity, by cost, by weight. We also have a second option here, which is how to distribute the additional costs during the PO receipt. And we have the option to either do it manually with a new command button, which will appear in the PO receipt, or automatically via the post button or the post transaction. For this demonstration, we will put it behind the post button to automate the injection. Once that's done, we'll move on to the purchase order module. When we open the purchase order module, you will notice that there is a new additional cost tab. So we will set up a standard purchase order, selecting a vendor, an item with the standard location. We'll be putting in quantity 5 at a unit cost of $100. Prior to posting, we can go to additional cost tab, and here we will be selecting a new vendor, Freight Masters, and selecting an additional cost. The additional costs are actually presenting the same additional costs that are built into the purchase order module itself. So in this case, we'll select shipping for $100. We can add a second additional cost, Zen Brokers for duty, $50. These are the known additional cost estimates. As you can see, as you're building your additional costs, they actually present a summary at the bottom right corner of the screen to give you a summary of the additional costs that have been inserted, so someone can track the totality without having to scroll through each additional cost. We now post the purchase order and have a purchase order 45. To this point, we have just inserted the additional costs at the PO level. We'll now move on to the PO receipt. In the purchase order receipt, we will select our newly created purchase order. We will just receive all, and we'll take a look at the additional cost tab, which is the standard tab in PO receipts, just to notice that it's still empty. Prior to hitting post, this is empty. Users have the ability to go in here, but the idea is to automatically inject them with the post button. If in the options we had selected the option to have a command button, it would display just to the right of the history button, where a user would have the option to click that button to inject the additional costs from the PO. Otherwise, we will simply hit post. And after hitting post, if we re-inspect the additional costs, you can now see that those additional costs that were set in the PO are automatically inserted at the PO level. I'll quickly go over to the item so we could see the result of why we did this. In location details, if we select our newly created item, we'll notice that we have 5 on hand with an average cost of $130 versus an item last unit cost of $100. The $130 reflects the landed cost of the item that was received plus the spread of the additional costs. We'll now move on to having a look at container management landed cost. Companies that are importing product via containers lack the tools in Sage 300 to collect and analyze the many components that are related to freight management, including container content, bill of lading details, freight job details, and cost distribution for the various additional costs. Most commonly, they maintain these additional costs outside of their system in a collection of Excel files or in-house databases and struggle to align the timing of inventory receiving and freight-related additional costs. Our container management option now offers the ability to bring in these additional details to Sage 300 as an extension of the standard purchase order module. Before going into the individual screens that we've created, let's have a quick look at the setup area. We'll start off with the options. We've seen the PO options. Let's have a quick look at the IC options. So we've introduced a field called CBM, cubic meters. This is a standard field used in shipping freight charges and is a field that basically allows us to know the volume that an item will occupy within a container. We have the option to either have it as a standalone field, optional field, or as a collection of width, length, and height that would present as optional fields. Once we've set this value, we will then be able to see in the item itself that we have a new optional field that is the CBM, and we could introduce the value straight in. For the weight of an item, we actually will use the built-in unit weight that is already found within the item itself. The combination of CBM and weight is a determining factor for how much product can be loaded in a container. Going back to the options, we also have introduced documents. So we're introducing bill of ladings, containers, and freight jobs to the system, and we're using the same numbering, typical numbering system that we see throughout all the modules within the Sage 300 environment. Once we're done with the options, we could then see that we've introduced a bunch of other types. Most important is the container type. So we're able to define the different types of containers that we'll be working with. So a 20-footer, a 40-footer as examples. And within these definitions, we introduce what is the maximum weight and the maximum volume that both could use. So when filling a container, we actually will measure total CBM and total weight simultaneously so a user can understand when a container is full. We also introduced the concept of pallets. If a customer prefers to fill containers using pallets instead of CBM, there actually is that one option as well. After this, we have the ability to define final locations, which could be inventory locations that can be defined within jobs and containers. We're able to define freight forwarders, Incoterms, and these can be commonly just added for the Incoterms that are going to be used by any customer. These are 5 very popular ones. Optional fields have been added to every level of every screen that we've done. So bill of ladings can have additional fields over and above the ones that we've introduced. Same thing with containers, additional cost details, and jobs. Ports allows someone to define the common ports that are being used within a company. And we'll see where all of these values are used in the screens that will follow. Shipping lines is the final one. Examples, CMA and Maersk as examples. Now let's have a look and see how all of this is applied. If we go back to our purchase order screen, with this new option, we now have a checkbox that we've added to the PO screen that's called Freight Related. By checking on Freight Related, you will see that we now have introduced 2 new columns, Total CBM and Chargeable Weight. These are calculated fields that read off the definition within the item. So if we take a quick peek at this item, we'll see the values that we've established for demonstration. So this is an item that weighs 2.2 pounds and has a calculated CBM of 0.11. Within a purchase order, when we order quantity 100, I will change the values just so you could see the difference. The CBMs and the chargeable weight are recalculating on the fly. These are not editable fields, they are calculated. So when we put in quantity 100, this item represents a total CBM cubic meters, 11 cubic meters, and it also represents 2,200 pounds. If we look at why these values matter, well, within the container type, we will later on see that they play with the total CBM and the total max weight. If we post this, we'll then move on to our next screens. Now, why did we add the freight related checkbox? For two reasons. One was to add the additional columns, and two, so that there's a way to segregate purchase orders that are non-container managed versus purchase orders that need to be allocated onto containers. Only the freight related purchase orders will show up to be purchase order lines that need to be managed in containers. Once a user has established this purchase order as being freight related, he will then go into XC transactions, where they will have an option to either create a bill of lading and or a container and or the freight job. The order of the transactions, quite frankly, doesn't matter because in different companies they occur in different orders. Generally speaking, they can begin by defining a container and filling a container, or they can put in a bill of lading, whichever happens first. So a bill of lading is defined. Opening up the screen, we have a standard tab for bill of lading. Have a quick look at an existing one. We have our internal bill of lading numbers. We have the official document number that was sent to us from the shipping company. We have a related job, and we will see that later on how that relates. Status, these are just standard fields that are commonly seen on bill of ladings. Any additional fields that are not defined here can actually be added via the optional fields that we defined in the setup. We've also introduced anywhere there's a finder is essentially reading from the setup tables that we have previously defined. Most importantly, we've added additional costs. Now, similar to purchase orders, we've added the field. We're able to add one or more additional vendors with their related costs. The additional cost fields themselves are defined in purchase order setup. Bottom right corner, we could see a summary of the different vendors that are being added to this bill of lading individually. And then we can see the related purchase order details. Now, the matching of these lines is done in a job, but you can already see with this bill of lading which lines is it related to. Bottom right corner, we have totaling. Again, more important within the container screen than a bill of lading. In addition to being able to add the fields and the additional costs, because this is an extender-based screen, we can actually leverage existing Orchid tools such as Document Management Link, which allows us to pop open the DML screen and essentially drag and drop and store related documents that have been sent. Once the bill of lading is complete, we'll next look at the container screen. So in the container screen is where we define containers. Again, we have an internal container code versus the container document. It's important to make that distinction because sometimes a buyer will want to define and fill a container prior to actually ordering a container. Once they've ordered the container, they can then come back and identify with the serial number attributed to the container. Again, we relate to a job, which we'll see in the next screen, cost locking, also to be defined. Status and additional date fields are very valuable fields that are usually maintained in Excel externally. This has everything to do with planning and returns, critical dates, discharge dates, return dates. Related to the planning behind that is important because there's additional charges that'll be incurred if containers are not returned within specified dates that are allocated. Most importantly, we define the container type. Very important field because this is the container type defines the allowed volume and weight related to a container, which will be required when we get to our job screen. As we did with the bill of lading, we've added additional costs. These are additional costs that are related directly to the container itself. So we make the distinction on costs that are related to bill of ladings versus costs that are related to the containers themselves. This is important so that we can make the distinction on how to spread the costs when receiving begins at a later time. We've added the additional optional fields tab. We've added the cross relationship to the bill of ladings, and we've added the cross relationship to the purchase order detail lines, all of which are related on the job screen, which is the following screen. Before showing you freight jobs, we're going to actually walk you through the typical workflow that a buyer goes through to establishing purchase orders and additional costs and managing the entire import freight job. The typical first step is to actually establish purchase orders. So we're going to quickly show a couple of purchase orders that we've put together. And in this case, we have purchase order 43. We're buying 2 products. Here are the quantities. And the CBM that we've established in the item actually is immediately calculated here. The cubic meters. This establishes the volume that this item would take in a container. So 43 has also an additional, no, this one has no additional cost on the PO itself. And in purchase order 44, same thing, similar item, CBM calculated. And in this case, we did establish one additional cost in this purchase order for duties. So in this case, we're saying that $300 of duties will apply specifically to items that are only on this PO. Once the POs are established, the typical next step that a buyer will go through is to establish the containers, filling containers, not necessarily ordering containers, but planning the containers themselves. So in order to do that, this is when we first go into the freight job itself. So though we've given access to bill of lading screen, container screen, the central screen is actually the freight job. The freight job is what brings purchase orders, bill of ladings, and containers all together into one place. Created just a basic framework for a freight job. We've established some booking confirmation. That might come before or later. Shipping lines, loading, freight forwarders, all information that goes into the planning itself. These are some very common fields, different statuses, pending booking, so we could move the status along of a job. The reason this is important is once we've actually established the entire job, this represents essentially a vessel, a ship movement. So you could establish that it's booked, is it sailed, has it arrived, and build out the different types of reporting tools that could be used in the planning phase of this work. So we have a tab for containers, bill of ladings, and cargo details. So though we mentioned that you could create the container and create the bill of lading in the other provided screens, we've actually made it so that the freight job gives easy access to both inserting existing containers or flat out creating new containers with a new container button at the bottom, and very similar setup for the bill of lading screen. So freight job represents PO lines, which containers they're on, which bill of ladings they're associated to. Going along with the typical process, once a buyer establishes their purchase orders, they don't necessarily have bill of ladings yet, but they do want to establish which POs will go onto this line. So I'm going to empty these items off for a second here. Just quick refresh on the screen. And what I want to do is actually insert from here. So a buyer will have created his POs, will come into a new freight job. Let me just load it up again and go to the container detail screens. Doesn't necessarily have to go to container and bill of lading to start. They would go to the cargo detail screen first and establish which PO lines they want to plan out. In here, when we click insert and hit the finder on the purchase order lines, we're actually showing only purchase order detail lines that have not been established to freight jobs yet. So how do we know what makes a freight job? What makes a PO line on a freight job? Just a quick peek back to the purchase order screen. As you might have noticed, we've actually added the field freight related, and this is where that comes into play. So when we call up PO 43 or 44, you'll notice the freight related checkbox has been checked on. This is done so that we can distinguish which purchase orders need to be managed inside of container management and which are not. So someone might still have purchase orders that have nothing to do with bringing it across the ocean. So once we've checked on the freight related, we're able to then go back to the freight screen and select. So going back to the freight job, we're able to now see that we're able to see these 3 lines. This might be a whole selection of lines. We can double click select yes, 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 or quite frankly, just click select all, deselect all. And once we've selected our purchase order lines that have not yet been placed in a freight job, we say submit, and it drops them into the cargo detail lines as purchase orders we expect to place in containers. I'll have you just quickly notice that if we click on the finder, We've actually taken advantage of, some tools, some functionality that you've classically seen in other Orchid tools, like Control F. So click on a field and Control F and have the options for the filtering. So we've actually incorporated that directly in here as well. And we're going to say cancel. So now that you have a job, you've established which purchase order lines are going to be managed and need to be placed in containers. Next step is to actually establish containers. We've already created a couple of containers, but we'll have a quick look here. If I hit the Finder on this job, I don't see any containers. That's because we need to go to the Container tab and either insert existing containers or create a new container. So in my case, I'm going to say container 1. So container 1 is a 40-foot container. If we double click on this, by the way, it will actually take us directly to the container screen. Again, we're giving the options to fully manage everything related to level 2 container management directly from the freight job screen. So we'll come back to this to review what the additional costs are later. For the time being, we're just essentially building the container. So we say that we want container 1, we go back to the cargo details and start placing our stock in containers. As we'll notice on a specific line, we'll know that it's a PO, a specific PO line, the quantity. Most importantly, what is the total CBM, cubic meters, that this will occupy, and the total weight. For any container, essentially, you either have to max out the volume or the weight, so whichever comes first. So what you'll see is, as we're selecting the containers, so I'm going to say container 1, and now I'm already starting to see something at the bottom right corner. So what you're seeing in the bottom right corner is a summary of the container. The reason there's a blank line is because there's an actual line that still doesn't have a container. We're actually giving you a summary of how much is not placed in a container yet. But most importantly, per container line, we're already giving you the preview of what's going on. You've selected these two lines to go into one container, but we quickly see that, yes, we have plenty of remaining weight, but we've already exceeded the cubic meters. In this case, we would go back to the container tab and say, well, I need a second container. So insert and say, I now need container 2 as well. So a second 40 footer. Go back to the container detail and say, well, this one is actually the problem. 64 is quite excessive. It's a big piece. So maybe switch this one out to container 2, which is plenty, and then put the last line in container 1. So essentially allowing you to mix and match different purchase orders into containers. And that's kind of the real goal here. Filling a container does not necessarily work as a perfect match with our purchase orders. So we're giving you the flexibility to mix and match purchase orders into containers, either one purchase order into many containers or many purchase orders into one container. Both work. Okay. Summarize this, we'll see that container 1 has now a remaining space of 25 cubic meters. We could still add some more. And container 2 is quite full. We only have 3 cubic meters left and plenty of weight. So weight is really not the problem in this case, but it goes by industry. Last step is, as we're getting closer to shipping, well, your manufacturer or whoever's delivering the product to you is going to eventually give you a bill of ladings to establish. So here's where we could either go here and click on new bill of lading. In my case, I've already created a bill of lading, so I'm just going to insert and select a bill of lading. And in this case, I go back to container detail, cargo detail, and establish which lines go with which bill of ladings. I will say PO 43 is on bill of lading 1, and I'll insert a second bill of lading. Now that the bill of lading is inserted, go back to the cargo detail and establish that PO 44 is on bill of lading 2. And this kind of completes the picture. Now we have the purchase order detail lines that we expect to have in this case, 2 containers. We have the option to relate bill of ladings to each PO line. Again, if you do not have bill of ladings, but most probably you have bill of ladings, this is where we could connect all those dots. We also see at the bottom to summarize how the containers are filled. So we have a nice visibility to know that we're not exceeding our limits. To go back to the individual containers and bill of ladings, this is where we've established that there are going to be costs on the individual containers. So if we go back to container 1, we're just going to review which additional costs we've actually established on them. This is container 1, and on this one, we've established that there's 2 additional cost vendors. One is Freight Masters for $3,500, and a second one is Port Handlers for drayage fees, $500. And we can actually see the summary of the two without opening them one by one. We've added a quick summary review at the bottom, so we can see that's on container 1. We'll quickly look at container 2. On container 2, we only have one additional cost, which is Freight Masters for $3,200. These are additional costs that are applicable to a container. We then have the same concept for bill of lading. So we're going to quickly look what we've put on these 2 bill of ladings as additional costs. So bill of lading 1 has a duty charges of $200, only one. Bill of lading 2 has the same Zen brokers, also a duty charge, $300 on a second one. Just to recap why we're doing this. The main goal of this is to have a proper spread of costs. So to review how this actually gets spread, as a concept here, we have 2 purchase orders with different quantities that have different cubic measurement. Each product is essentially responsible for a portion of its costs. So what we're using the just to review here, we're using the cubic meter, the volume of occupancy within a container, and then relating that to the costs that are applied directly to a bill of lading and directly to containers. As you can see here, we have one container that has a direct cost but spans over 2 POs. So typically without this tool, someone is manually splitting up an invoice in additional costs by pulling out a calculator to figure out what portion to spread on each PO per PO line. This is what we're trying to resolve, to automatically calculate what that spread is. And that's where I could take you now to the last screen, which is the additional cost summary. And if we save and just refresh our screen, we'll see the result of all of this. So here we could see that now we have at the top, we've summarized the different additional costs. We're saying the source, bill of lading, container, or purchase order. So our purchase orders have a couple that summarize to $550. We have bill of ladings that happen to summarize to on the same supplier that summarize to $500. Freight Master summarizes to $6,007, and port handling of $500. These are basically totaling by supplier. That is then cross-referenced to the bottom line, which is here. So prior to even doing a receipt, we're able to see what our additional cost impact is. A lot of people want to know what is this going to cost me so I could figure out pricing. Well, we're actually able to show you this now prior to the receiving process and not have to do it in Excel, because we're able to show you what are the costs related to the purchase order. So the first 3 columns is per purchase order line, what is the PO cost, then the proportion of purchase order additional cost, then the split of the bill of lading additional cost, and the container cost for total additional cost per detail line. And the last field is essentially your expected unit landed cost. So we're taking the basic PO cost plus the spread of the additional cost according to the different spreads of cubic meters to basically tell you that while your product that's $15 is actually going to come in at $16, your $21 is going to come in at $30. Remember, this one is the one that's on a container all by himself. Therefore, he takes the brunt of the landed cost. Now that you can see the actual review of what's going to happen, essentially to continue with the typical flow of how things would work with the buyer, this is all established. He would set his job to his status to eventually sailed, and then he would wait for his product to arrive. Reporting to know what's on the water, what's shipped, what still has to be established. This is where status comes into play. To further the final steps here, the main event again happens in the purchase order receiving. So we're going back to a normal functionality of Sage. We're using Sage's purchase order functionality. In the receipts purchase order, you will still receive either by purchase order or multiple POs. Typically speaking, if we were to say, let's receive our purchase order 44, this is well, I'll select 43 actually, just to have multiple lines. 43. All right, just to have a purchase order with multiple lines, I'll click on Receive All. Now, for the purpose of demonstration, we actually activated the additional cost button. We could either use it to clicking on a button to insert the additional cost, or we could have it in our options to work through the post button itself. Why would we put it through the post button itself? If you had any barcode scanners, any third party that's producing the PO receipt automatically and someone who's not actually on a screen, then you want to have it through the post button so that the third party applications will fully integrate with this and the additional costs would insert themselves. For the purpose of demonstration, again, we've activated the additional cost button and we'll click the additional cost button. And let's see what the additional cost rendered. In order to actually see what just happened here, essentially the additional cost spread that we saw in the freight job summary actually got inserted as the additional costs, various ones. So we have freight masters, we have Zen brokers, we have port handlers. Okay, maybe to see this properly, what I'll do is I'll reopen the freight job, bring up the freight job, the additional cost summary, maybe have this in the background. Let's see if we could piece this together. Okay, so right here. All right, so let's look at our first one. What it did is Freight Masters is taxable freight. So $3,483. You'll notice that we actually use prorate manually because we're actually calculating the actual individual amounts and placing them per detail line via Sage's existing prorate manual function. So how this actually breaks down is in the prorate manual, we could see the different amounts. So Freight Masters is a combination of the $3,200 individual container cost that was essentially for one detail line. So he got the full $3,200. Then there's a portion of the $324 that is related to here because the other is related to another supplier. So $324 comes from Freight Masters, and the remaining balance actually comes from the last one, which is port handlers, which is the $40.56. This is divided by, these numbers come from the division of the CBM. This is where the CBM finally comes into play to actually split things up according to what's required. If we look at the second, the middle one, which is Zen Brokers came from the bill of lading. There's a total of $500. That is from, let's see, if we look back on the freight job, was actually split. $300 was for PO 44, and a sum total of $200 was for PO 43. So if we look at Zen Brokers, we'll see the $200 here, prorate manual, and the distribution should match up with the $80 we see here and the $120 we see there. The first line is the $250, which actually came from the same Zen broker, but based on an additional cost that we put right on the PO. And that's why you see the prorate by quantity, which is based on the purchase order method versus anything that's on bill of ladings or containers will actually calculate according to the cubic meters and spread and place all those values using the prorate manual function. So the sum total of all of this is when we hit post, we get purchase order receipt. Now we go back to standard Sage, and as we saw with level 1, the result of the purchase order the purchase order receipt will have a landed cost and a unit cost that are distinguished. So we'll take a quick look at the inventory control result of all of this. So to look at that, we'll close the purchase order receipt. We'll actually just move down the freight job. I'll leave this here because I'd like to actually prove that our unit cost 21, 15, 16, and 30 is what we're aiming at. And so if we look at the location details of these items, I'll just get them going side by side. Put this one here and bring up the freight job below it. So if we bring up our first item, which is 100, so 100 after the receiving, we have a last unit cost of 15 and our most recent is 16, which is our landed cost. If we look at our second item, similar unit cost of $21 to match up with the PO, but the most recent, and well, in this case average, but the most recent is $30, which means that's what the inventory control actually received, a pure landed cost. And that concludes the demonstration aspect of it. Just one last point, we're going to be, you'll notice that we also have analytical reports. These are some basic reports that we're going to be adding to our module. So just unassigned freight. Obviously, we could get to that from just going into the job, and our PO selection already shows us that. We'll have a separate report for that. A landed cost analysis is really just more of a report that will essentially give us the same result that we saw in our freight job additional cost summary, but with the actual transactions that amount to the dollar amounts. And the freight job summary is essentially a report that will piece those multiple tabs together to give you a summary of the jobs themselves and status. If you would like to know more about the product or have any questions on how we can help with the Orchid Extender in general, feel free to reach out to us by email or phone listed on the screen. Thank you once again for listening in on our Extended Landed Costing demonstration.